Good afternoon and welcome everybody this afternoon to the stories of the underserved. We have wonderful parents with us today that will share their experience in relation to how we can embrace the experience with therapy and social justice. The focus of this conversation will center around the book for the SPC, written by Sue Carey, who we have the pleasure of being with us today as one of our candidates. We also have Dr. Melissa Sue Carey, who is a social psychologist and assistant professor at the University of St. Louis, the owner of the Lawrence Simone Publishing House and the publisher of this wonderful book. And we have with us Dr. Heather LaSalle, who is assistant professor in the social work and equitable community practice department. Their full bios are located in the program, so I hope you are able to get to look at them. I would like to now, so that we can protect your time, we want to move things along, so I would like to now hand this time over to Sue Carey for the reading of her selected excerpts. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I can work. So I just want to say thank you to the university and to Dr. John for making it possible for us to gather today, but without Dr. John, there wouldn't be a book. She read my draft manuscript and felt that these stories were important, and I'm grateful for her vision and compassion. I thought because of where we're going to go with the panel discussion today, I wanted to read one of the stories aloud to you, excerpts from this story. The book encompasses the stories of more than 40 people that I have gotten to know over the years, where my church in Hartford has served a free community supper for the sake of building community. So we know that people need to be fed, but we also know that people need relationships, and the goal of our program was to forge those relationships. A lot of the book is about trying to challenge the stereotypes and stigma that are part of the human condition when we don't get to know people from different walks of life. So I want to challenge you as you listen to this story to think about maybe how many stereotypes in this one man's story might challenge you. So this is a story about a man named Papa Charles. A few diners use wheelchairs. One of them is Papa Charles, who stayed one wintry night in January 2020, just before the pandemic, to talk to me about his life. He was born in 1952 and identifies as African American. He's quick to smile and say hello. I was curious about who called him Papa and what it was like to get around Hartford in a wheelchair. He said, I was born in Hartford, although my mother lived in Yonkers, New York. When the time was near for me to be born, my mother came to Hartford to be with her mother. After I was born, the two of us went back to Yonkers. A few years later, when I was still a toddler, we moved here permanently. I was very close to my grandmother, and we had a special relationship. She was my protector. She was strict and made sure no one, not even my mother or my uncles, put a finger on me. In later years, she was senile, but she broke out in a big smile when she saw me. We lived in Bellevue Square in the North End. I went to Job Corps instead of high school. They flew me out there on a plane. It was my first plane ride to Colorado, Papa Charles said. I only stayed 6 months. I didn't like it there. You had to shake your sheets out at night to be sure there were no critters hiding. I transferred to a Job Corps site in Corpus Christi, Texas. I learned all the trades for construction and operated heavy equipment like giant bulldozers. We lived in a dorm and built a house from the ground up. That's how you learn all the trades, building a house from scratch. I finished Job Corps in 2 years and came back to Hartford because this is where my family is. I got work doing carpentry, Papa Charles said. One day I was working on a second-story porch when it collapsed. The wood was rotten underneath, but I didn't know it, and the porch gave way. I landed on concrete. The injury caused a neuropathy that runs from my neck to my toes. For a while, I could walk on my own, but then I needed a walker. It just got progressively worse. After about 12 years, I was in a wheelchair all the time. In 2016, there was a fire in my apartment building on Laurel Street. I couldn't use the elevator because of the fire, and I couldn't use the stairs on my own. The halls were filled with smoke, and it was terrifying. Finally, a neighbor helped me down the stairs. After the fire, the building was condemned, and I couldn't move back. Months later, my blood pressure was high, and I started having heart attacks. Papa Charles explained that he couldn't get permanent housing because his health situation was unstable. Between hospital stays, he lived at one of Hartford's shelters for homeless men. He was living there when he started coming to our Friday gathering. That's what we call our supper movement. Every morning, I ride this wheelchair up Main Street to Bellevue Square, he said. I have a friend there with 3 kids. I call them my grandchildren. They're 5, 10, and 15 years old. I wait with them for the school bus. They're good kids. They need someone they can talk to. Even more, they need someone who will listen to them. Kids should never be hit. If you develop trust and respect, then they'll have a place to turn to for help. I want all 3 of them to grow up and have a good life. Our conversation turned back to Papa Charles's wheelchair. It's more than 2 miles from the shelter to Bellevue Square. I asked him how he navigated the sidewalks, and I thought about the cracks in the seams that rise and fall like frost heaves. Winter's only half of it, he said. It isn't just the snow and the ice, it's the garbage that people throw on the ground, the furniture and junk that's abandoned at the curb, a trash can left in the middle of the sidewalk that I can't scoot around, and dog crap. I looked how down to earth he is. Dog crap, it gets up inside my wheels and then I bring it indoors. I don't want to run over it the same as people don't want to step in it. People should be responsible for picking up after themselves. Papa Charles sets off early in the morning when the shelter ejects its boarders. He uses the road instead of the sidewalk. He said, I get a kick out of seeing how fast this thing can go. When it's fully charged, it's pretty fast. A few weeks after our conversation, sit-down dining was suspended due to the pandemic. Papa Charles came a few times for a takeout dinner, but our visits were brief, and by the end of summer, he stopped coming. It wasn't until late in the second spring, the next year, that Papa Charles was back. He was upbeat and friendly. His quick smile was there. I got my own apartment now, he said. Papa Charles explained that he'd been in and out of the hospital. The shelter was contaminated with black mold, he said. The mold triggered my asthma and that aggravated the heart. The doctor at the emergency room noticed that I kept returning and got involved. He called the shelter, told them that they needed to provide permanent housing for me and get me out of there. He wouldn't discharge me if I was only going to go back to black mold. He kept calling the shelter until they moved me to one of the hotels they converted for homeless. A few months later, then, I got my own apartment. And it's made all the difference, Papa Charles said. For 4 years, my blood pressure was 200 to 220. Now it's 117, and I feel good. Papa Charles said the neuropathy in his legs had worsened. Some days his feet hurt, and some days he couldn't feel them at all. He can manage his daily needs, except for laundry. I'm particular about my laundry. I need to use fabric softener. When you sit all day, you need to make sure you're clean and that the fabric next to your skin is soft. But I need a nurse's help to stand up now. It's getting the laundry done that I struggle with the most. I have a friend, he said, and I babysit her 2-year-old son. When we met, she was homeless and I was still in the shelter. Her son was 2 months old then. She was so frazzled that I told her to let the baby's father take him for a day, and I paid for her to have a hotel room. She could sleep, take a long bath, watch TV, just pamper herself for a day. And you know, one day that little boy called me Grandpa Charles. It was the first time I heard him talk. He has a lot of energy and he gets frustrated easily. He pouts and I tell him, come over here. He crawls up on me and I just hold him. I'm teaching him to use words to say how he's feeling. I can just look at that child and he knows to calm himself down. I still see those grandchildren in Bellevue Square as often as I can. The boy got in trouble in school and his grandmother told me about it. And I told him, knock it off. Don't waste the chance you've got. Even though I'm in a wheelchair, my word carries weight. The boy settled down. Those kids mean the world to me. In the spring of 2022, Papa Charles met me in the park and introduced me to his friend Coco. She was a cook at the Chrysalis Center where he went for breakfast and lunch, and they've been friends for years. Coco told me how much she appreciated Papa Charles's kindness and gentleness. When she cooked on weekends, she often brought him a plate. While we were talking, a few of Papa Charles's friends joined in, and then a young woman appeared, carrying a sleeping child. It was the boy who first called him Grandpa Charles. His mother slipped him into Papa Charles's arms, joined our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I love that story because it just has so many different components of community, right? When we talk about the stranger, when we talk about the earth, when we talk about what are our responsibilities to each other, to one another. So I love that. So I have a few questions for our panelists. And we're going to start with Sue. Sue, what role do you believe your book plays in shaping public consciousness about social justice issues? And how do you use your platform as an author to contribute to the conversation around equity and inclusion?
How long do we? Can you hear me okay? Well, I think one of the most important things the book does, and that I did intentionally, was to try to shatter the stereotypes of a single story. I think that that when we really don't know somebody very well, it's a human tendency to just think that we do know them and that we can explain why they're in the situation that they're in. So I want to push back at those stereotypes, and I would say the most important part of all, that word silo, we group people. You know, you could group him as a Black man, you could group him as somebody who came out of a housing project, as somebody who's disabled. You might think that he never had a job, that he didn't graduate from high school. He did through the Job Corps. That even though he didn't father children, you might not think he has a relationship with children. You might think that somebody in his situation isn't able to do something generous for somebody else. It's one thing to pay for a hotel room and another to even appreciate that a mother is frazzled and to do something to help her be a good mother. So there's just so many layers to those stereotypes and trying to push back at that. I think part of how I'm using my platform is to talk about charity. There's a social justice that I think so many organizations today do charity because in some ways charity is easier. And charity gives us a sense for both the giver and the receiver of satisfying an immediate need. I have a need to be helpful or useful, and if I can go serve dinner, I can go home at night and feel good about it. Somebody else will not maybe have to go to bed hungry, but we have been serving dinner every Friday night. I was involved in the program that brought this about, so I've been doing this every Friday. I'm in the 15th year now. And there is a huge sorrow inside of me that I will see the same people next week. That I can serve dinner every week and I have not helped anybody lift themselves out of the conditions that made them need that dinner. So the opportunity to talk about justice, we need both. Don't prioritize one or the other. And I do think that when you are involved in charity, it's important to have a relationship with people that are being served, because you will be educated from that service and now know where to start working for social justice. I'll stop.
Thank you. I want to hear more. Thank you. Heather. As a social worker, you often witness systemic marginalized space. How do you navigate the tension between immediate charitable aid and long-term systemic change when working with clients?
Thank you. The stories in this book are inspiring, and I say that I'm here today with the resilience of a lot of those that I've worked with. So as a social worker, we don't just look at the person in front of us that may be experiencing anxiety, depression, hunger, but we zoom out and we really look at what other factors in the environment are influencing that person and their experiences. And so it helps to destigmatize and remove the focus on the individual, right? And look at what's happening in society. Where are those injustices, and how would any of us be experiencing those same feelings had we, had that hand in life? So the idea of, first, clearly we want to have a foundation of managing safety in crisis. So as a social worker, I tend to support people there. I also think that food is very important. So starting with food as foundational, it's something we all need for survival and sustenance. And it's something that really can level all of us to a space where I'm hungry, you're hungry, she's hungry, right? And we can share a shared opportunity and experience without it mattering who we are, how much money is in our bank account, and really having that genuine and authentic connection. So navigating the tensions within society can be overwhelming, especially now in the current socio-political climate that we're living in. It can get easy to get frustrated or to say, what can I do? And it also can become easy to view ourselves as the helper. And that's really what I appreciated about your book, was that it was about everyone kind of coming together and recognizing our power is equal, right? We each have a vote. We each have the ability to call our state representatives. That said, is not everyone feels empowered to do so, or that their voice matters, or that their story matters. And so just hearing, this story that was shared with you today, there was an opportunity to build trust. There was opportunities to build connection, to be able to recognize that there's some pretty serious health challenges and equity challenges, but that, Sue, you were able to really nurture the greatness and bring about what was the greatness in this individual. And I think that helps to empower individuals to, if we can recognize what they're bringing to our sense of community, then we can maybe hold their hands. And I challenge students to really think about, it's not about us fixing the problem, right? And I've heard a lot, don't work harder than your client. And I really challenge that, because we're all people. And sometimes, if we're in having heart surgery, we hope the cardiologist is working harder than we are, right, on the problem. So sometimes we need to work harder to help people because of whatever barriers that are in place, often because of our system, right, and the injustices that exist there. So sometimes it's holding a hand, making a phone call, inviting to dinner, helping to navigate some of those barriers. And, with individuals and families that I work with, I think it's really important to have them see their stake in the community and their political power and bringing their voice and a story like this to people in power that can make some changes, and just having a purpose. So as a social worker, that's really integrated.
A lot of helping to have its smallest, right? Story you shared. He found purpose in a lot of, like, he himself, so not facing the problem, helping them.
So much greatness in the story and that individual.
Thank you. Melissa, from a psychological perspective, how do biases and stereotypes influence the way society views charitable? Are certain groups more likely to receive help while others are overlooked? So 2 questions.
So when we think about stereotypes and biases, first understand that we have to perceive others, right? So when we perceive those who need help, we might see them as deserving or not deserving. Another thing about seeing people who need help is that we tend to be empathetic and are more likely to empathize with those who look like us, right? We also have to look at personality traits of the person who's helping. So things like gender, things like empathy, things like religion, those are also traits that make them more helpful. Then we can also look at which organizations are people more likely to donate. So people might donate to Doctors Borders, helping children, like what do those things have in common? We all think about children, we think about the environment, we think about food and housing, right? But when it comes to thinking about people who are poor or thinking that people are criminal, we're less likely to meet those groups. There's also something in psychology called the just world, which is that people get what they did something. So when we see people in a wheelchair, perhaps we're like, well, you did something I shouldn't have done here. Why didn't you end up homeless? Maybe you go to work, you feel that. So when we believe that people deserve the condition that they're in, we're less likely to help them. What Sue's story is to is to basically give people humanity, help us relate to them, help us see that who we need. I think on my own porch, all to be without people. So as we think about how we can engage with the people in our community, we really want to have a face to them, not just see them as someone on the street, probably did drugs, probably did some kind of crime, but instead say, what about his money? What about his sister?
So we do have a bonus question, but before we go there, I want to open it up to any of you who might have questions or comments. Any curiosities, anything about the story that touched you? Now can
So,
yes.
one of the things that I'm very curious about seems, and I don't know if it's correct, that this is not just church about serving people who need, but rather it's a community help where you've all done. So it equalizes the relationships some, is that?
Yes.
And so how, like, that seems unusual to me in a really good way. I wonder how your church can develop that really.
So I'm really glad that you asked that question, and I almost wonder if we peaked from this question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's great because it is part of what I really wanted to delve into. Because other places where I've been invited to talk, people will bring up our goal is to build a community. And in some ways, woven between the stories of how this dinner came about and then what's evolved over the years, how did community get built? One of the first principles we had when we started offering dinner, and it was a group of church people who said, we're just going to offer dinner. And the first rule, if I could be that bold, was you have to sit at the table and eat with everybody else. This can't be a dividing barrier that I'm on this side serving. My job is to be the happy giver, and your job is to be the grateful receiver. And so it was very important from the beginning that one, we all eat from the same pot. That was part of your story. We're all hungry. And I can't tell you how many people come and say, I'll have dinner when I get home. Oh no, this is for them. I don't want to take anything away from them. And to be fair, I think a lot of people have to grow through that. But for the core of us that began, it was, we will be on both sides of the table, which means, well, when I go sit down to eat, who's going to come up here? So it was that invitation of, would you mind serving the potatoes while I go get a bite to eat? And that idea that you asked me, I can't tell you how many people, when they got asked to do something, they felt so important. And there's a chapter in here about the importance of, you can do something for me. So learning to be givers and receivers, that I really think that we see the value in other people when we acknowledge, I got something from you. So that was one thing that began as the core, but then what happened as time went on, people, first of all, they said, can I help? And I learned to always say yes. And all of the people that I worked with, you could see me shaking my finger of saying, you need to know how to divide your job in half. You don't own this job. And when somebody says, can I help? Our job is to accept that. And that is where belonging really happens, is then people feel like they're on both sides. So learning how to say yes to every offer. And it's just as challenging. People bring their strengths as well as their weaknesses, but you work with that. And then what we learned, one of the biggest changes for me, was that, excuse me, I'm trying to think of a good example. It's so integrated that I don't divide it, but somebody might come and say, you need this. And it was like, well, that's not our mission. That's not what we do. But we learned that people saw needs. I don't have that need, but other people saw a need. And in seeing the need, they also knew how to fill it. And so that was part of learning how to say yes to every offer to help. And in fact, somebody might feel uncomfortable taking potatoes from me, but they weren't uncomfortable taking it from someone else. And in the long run, building community meant, my primary goal isn't to build your relationship with me, but to build your relationship with this relationship. And to learn how to foster, broker, nurture. It's kind of an answer all over the place. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
So it's a little more of a comment that we can build on too, is a lot of times what we can see some of the more visible effects of poverty or the wheelchair usage and things like that. But really, when you think about the Alice community, asset limited income constrained employees, those who are living just barely above the poverty line, which is close to about 40% of the state of Connecticut. As we think of Connecticut as a rich state, but 40% of the population is living that. It adds a whole different layer that there's invisibility almost to those people, which would have a big psychological impact, and I'm sure in the social work world we'll have to navigate more. I mean, we try and introduce it to our pharmacy and PA students that, someone can't pay a $5 copay. It's not because it might make a difference of putting a meal on the table. So it's when we talk about more than merely the eyes can see, there's a big segment of our population that's a bill away from poverty.
Yeah, I I appreciate that, the idea of othering. I regularly start my students in social work program and I share a little bit about my own story. And so as a PhD student, I was working at a school and I whistle blew and I quickly found myself not having a job and driving a very nice luxury car with my nails done and my hair done and needing to go to the food pantry. Because my husband's income covered the mortgage and the car bills and all of that, right? But it left us short in regards to, being able to afford food. And that experience, I share that with some vulnerability to say there's often a level of invisibility amongst us, right? And there's likely people in this room that maybe had to put something back at the grocery store in order to, make some tough decisions these days, especially. So really thinking about how we're all only a paycheck away, or we're all, experiencing the same human challenges and experiences and that invisibility. And something I really appreciated in the book was you spoke about the church that was often like the parking lot was a cut through for people in the community, right? And so there was the people that came from the suburbs to church and then, everyone else. And the idea of building community, it existed. It was there. There was this amazing community. It was more about building, right, and belonging, and that we all belong together within this space. And I know I reference a lot a story that is told by Cory Booker, who was a Yale graduate, and he went to Newark before he became mayor, and he said, he went into the urban housing development and knocked on the matriarch of kind of the community's door and said, I'm Cory Booker, and I just graduated from Yale, and I'm a community organizer, and I'm here to help. And she took him on a tour down into the sort of busy street intersection outside the building. And she said, what do you see? And he looked around and he said, I see people selling drugs. I see boarded up buildings. I see graffiti. And she turned around and said, you can't help me. And she walked back to her apartment and he raced after her and said, what do you mean? What do you mean? I'm here to help. And she said, if all you can see is the problems and not the strengths in my community, you can help me. And so he used that as a lesson, right, to kind of spawn his political career. And so I use that a lot in my class because as I send social workers out into the community, we regularly recognize the needs, right? We recognize the problem, and it's not a bad thing. It's the ways our brains are wired is to look for those things, right, that impact our survival. We have to look at where the problems are so we can protect ourselves. But as evolved beings, we want to challenge ourselves to look for the greatness, to look for the strength, to look for the Papa Charles who is there, building connection, helping to care for children, and really trying to kind of have that sense. He has a whole lot of community around him, but often may have been overlooked for that strength.
I really want to touch base on the idea that there's so many people close to that poverty line, but they're not. And I want to get personal to the academic. There was a New York Times article, I put a feature on the timeline. They were talking about adult professors and how many adults are well. And so we live in a society where to go to school, move up in your social life. And so professors of all the status, that doesn't mean about adjunct professors, many of them probably have adjunct. It's because they have a class PhD doesn't matter.
Any other questions?
So I'm interested in what the reactions to people's stories would be told for this book.
Whose reactions?
The people's stories.
What were their reactions to their stories? Trying to think of where to start. I think, so part of the process was we started having this dinner. A man from the neighborhood who liked to play with his camera came and started taking these, what he thought were interesting shots of people, went home, developed it, brought them back, shared with people. People were kind of excited about seeing themselves. And over time, he developed this practice that continues now of taking these 8x10, very close cropped images of people. That was a huge turning point. Just the idea that people would have their pictures taken. And when you walk into the dining hall today, which is about the size of this room, both sides of the hall are papered with these photos, more than almost 500 pictures of people. And I talk about the photos on the walls, and the photos are an example about who is welcomed in. You think about, especially if you're in Hartford, how many places you can walk from the street inside, and who you see on the street is who you see inside, which is not my usual experience of Hartford. Places like the library, you're likely to see that. So it was a big statement to put those pictures on the wall. Not everybody's comfortable with that. So that was a big sort of trust test to be comfortable with putting your picture on the wall. But often I would say to folks, you've been coming week after week after week. Why do you keep coming back to dinner? And every so often a diner would, I don't want to hit, they'd wave their arm. The pictures, I know when I walk in here, I fit in. But people's reactions to their stories, somebody saw the pictures and said, we need to have stories go with the pictures. And I began to collect like 2/3 of a page of stories. And I would ask people, what got you to Hartford? Were you born here? Did you come from somewhere else? Do you have family? Share a memory from your childhood, because we've all been kids riding bikes, going to school. And do you have a message for the community? Stories were very limited. Most people, it's like, what's it to you? What's going to happen with this? It's none of your business. And now I know that was a reflection of lack of trust. Even though we've been doing this for 10 years, 8 years, not every week. What's it to you? And then the pandemic hit. And we couldn't sit down to eat. We continued to serve. But fortunately, spring came. And so folks who had been engaged, I said, we could meet in the park, and we meet at the gazebo. And what had been an hour conversation turned into 20 to 40 hours. And we would meet for an hour or two. I'd draft a story, then I'd read it to them, and I would change anything they said to change. Just, am I a good listener? Did I get it right? And often what happened was people would now add more detail and start to fill in. And people began to tell me things that even their friends didn't know. And in that process, I think it really became a moment of healing. So there's one story of the man Lamont in here. And I've known Lamont for years. We all knew Lamont. He was a very visible, wiry guy, full of energy, always talking under his breath, like all the things he needed to remember, he didn't want to forget. And one day during the pandemic, we were sitting side by side. Things had gotten quiet. There was a lull. Oh, I forgot to tell you a piece. Whenever somebody, the community passed away, it would just send him into a tailspin. He'd be so upset about it, talking about it, mumbling about it. He would build memorials. He would get their picture. He'd set it on a chair. He'd find little things to embellish the chair with to remember somebody. And I would observe people saying, Lamont, get over it. It's been 2 months. You know, it's not your father, it's not your brother, it's not, get over it, Lamont. And I remember thinking, this just feels kind of cruel. He has a hard time with this. So this one day we were sitting side by side. Things were so quiet. And he said to me, when I was young, my mother was shot in the chest and killed. And I was able to find this much in an old Hartford Current newspaper. And the article read, on Saturday night in a domestic dispute, Rosetta Scott was shot in the chest and died a few hours later at the hospital. And he and his siblings were not home at the time. But it began to explain that childhood trauma, which in my opinion, not as a psychologist, was never addressed as a child. And now he's a 50-something-year-old man reliving this again and again. And we stopped seeing him as a child. And many of these other stories, there are stories of abuse. Another man, when he was 5 years old, cops showed up at the house and told his mother, your husband died in Vietnam. So the mom moved to Chicago to be closer to her family for support. And 2 years later, the cops show up again at the house, and his mother and twin sisters died in a car accident. And he describes the next 7 years of being in foster. The next 7 years of going through 23 different foster homes. And then you read where he's at today, and you can see how his coping strategies as a child is the only coping strategies he has as an adult. But I think in receiving the stories without judgment, receiving times I thought I needed to be, and I'll talk to that, I'm sorry. I knew I needed to be an impartial observer, but I say there came a point where you had to put the story aside and just grieve, or whatever it was. Just grieve. Nobody had ever grieved them before. And that's what mattered. I think in that there were some healing moments.
It's about being present. That's so we do want to leave time for Sue to be able to, she's going to be doing book signings, so if there's anyone interested in being able to purchase, it's $20.
It is $20, and I just want to say all of the proceeds from book sales go to the Boys and Girls Club, which started in Hartford over 100 years ago. And there is a Boys and Girls Club in our neighborhood. And as a community, we agreed to invest in the Boys and Girls Club, invest in children. That was our way of giving back and making this a bigger